Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Hannah Arendt's book of theory, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which I have two main takes on. One is that the central idea that Arendt puts forth about totalitarianism as a governing regime is really, really interesting and insightful. The second big insight is that this book could be much, much shorter than it actually is. So, the book moves through 3 essays, each of which is itself a book-length project. The first on antisemitism, the second on imperialism, and then finally the third on totalitarianism. To the extent that the book itself is about totalitarianism, much of what's in the first 2 essays could be drastically condensed, because effectively they set the stage for the main argument that Arendt is talking about in the essay on totalitarianism. But there's so much detail. So, if you wanted to take the essays on antisemitism or imperialism in and of themselves, they're good. They're solid and they're well supported, etc., etc. But if you want to take them as part of a book on totalitarianism, the points that they make, in my opinion, don't necessarily demand the page space that Arendt devotes to them. Now that's philosophically and theoretically not necessarily a weakness. It's something that didn't really work for me, because primarily what I wanted to get out of this was Arendt's argument about totalitarianism as a system. So the first 2 essays set the stage for this by establishing how particular sets of conditions developed in Europe prior to the actual rise of totalitarianism. So the essay on anti-Semitism largely focuses on the history of the Jewish people in Europe in especially the 18th and 19th centuries, and how we essentially were an international force, in the sense that Jewish families, Jewish networks of connections, etc., etc., transcended the borders of European nation-states. The Rothschilds family probably being the greatest example, because at one point they were the chief bankers and the people who supplied capital to Britain, France, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So Jews were an international European people in the way that most European ethnic groups or national groups tended to be specific to particular nation states. The other thing is that, unlike other Europeans, in Arendt's argument, Jews were specifically supportive of the government as such. So Jews didn't develop independent class interests because you had Jews of every social class. They didn't develop. We were never a large enough population in any European country to defend ourselves as such, and so traditionally we had looked to local governments or nobles, warlords, whatever it was, for protection. And so Jews had a long tradition of turning to the government for help and working for whatever form of government it was. And so these are things that then sort of set the stage for totalitarianism later on, because totalitarianism's ambitions become global. They exceed the scope of the nation state, and totalitarianism is entirely principled on one's relationship to the government, albeit in different ways than we see with Jews in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the framework is there, the structure of possibility is there, even if the conditions themselves change dramatically. We get the same kind of thing in the second essay on imperialism, where Arendt talks about the rise of race science as an organizing principle for the universe. And again, she talks about the role of international ambition in shaping national projects. But it's really, for me, in the third essay on totalitarianism itself that this book gets fascinating. Because essentially, Arendt, she makes a distinction between tyranny or dictatorship and totalitarianism. So people like Mussolini became dictators, but not totalitarians in Arendt's view, because because dictatorship is a sort of prequel stage for the potential of totalitarianism. So the totalitarian leader, or proto-totalitarian leader more correctly, will tend to be a demagogue, someone who will sort of use rhetoric and whip the masses into a frenzy. And specifically by the masses, Arendt means the sort of large group of people within any society, particularly a democratic, liberal democratic, or semi-democratic society, that feel that the government does not actually speak for them. And that's frequently a large percentage of the population, despite the sort of theory of democracy, which says that the people are represented. So it's a sort of lumpen proletariat, in a way, of democratic representation, right? Because in Marxist class analysis, the lumpen proletariat are the sort of unorganized, not workers necessarily, because the workers exist as a specific proletariat class, but the lumpen proletariat are the sort of disorganized people who aren't working, who, whatever it is, in some way don't sort of fit into the Marxist schema of production within the socioeconomic sphere. The masses are the same kind of thing. They're not engaged in politics, they're not interested in politics, they don't feel that politicians or the political system represent them. And this is the group that the demagogue, the proto-totalitarian leader, sort of enlists and energizes. And one of the interesting, important key points here is that while the proto-totalitarian leader will give lip service to a particular political project, he's never, and it's almost always a he, he's not actually devoted to a specific end. Or more specifically, the end is a sort of utopic project of racial purity in the case of the Nazis, or the culmination of dialectic materialism, historical materialism for Stalin and Soviet totalitarianism. So it's a vaguely defined future project that can always be, that's infinitely malleable. Like, there's no specific steps that are ever laid out that need to be taken in order to get to that endpoint. What's required to get to that endpoint can change overnight. It's very much dependent on the particular whims of the totalitarian leader who defines what the natural or historical project is. So that's one element, is that this is an interesting sort of division, because what the masses basically want is victories. They want to feel good about themselves. What the totalitarian leader does is puts into practice an ideology that is taken to its extreme logical limit. So to give you an example of this, if we look at Nazi racism, right? So the typical racist who hasn't sort of made it to the level of the Nazi yet, the typical racist starts from the assumption that some races or ethnicities are better than others. And because racism tends to be grounded in some version of social Darwinism, with its sort of misguided belief that some races are more fit to live than others, the racist has a kind of implicit faith that at some point the less fit races will die out. Now the Nazi takes that to the next logical step, this probably final logical step of that progression, which is if there are races that are less fit to live, and if those races are going to die out eventually because that's the movement of nature, then there's no ethical problem with killing those races or killing the people of those races. So the racist logic there inherently tends toward genocide, and it's just the Nazi who makes that final step beyond what the traditional racist endorses. So the overall project of the totalitarian mission is an extremist ideological project, totally divorced from practical concerns, ethical concerns, anything like this. But then the other... So I want to read this section of Arendt's book to maybe try and clear this up or illustrate this a little bit better. So she says here, the trouble with totalitarian regimes is not that they play power politics in an especially ruthless way, but that behind their politics is hidden an entirely new and unprecedented concept of power, just as behind their realpolitik lies an entirely new and unprecedented concept of reality. Supreme disregard for immediate consequences rather than ruthlessness, rootlessness and neglect of national interests rather than nationalism, contempt for utilitarian motives rather than unconsidered pursuit of self-interest, idealism, i.e. their unwavering faith in an ideological fictitious world, rather than lust for power. These have all introduced into international politics a new and more disturbing factor than mere aggressiveness would have been able to do. So what Arendt means by this is that the totalitarian project, the project of racism or of historical materialism, leads the totalitarian to abandon practical or utilitarian concerns. And one of Arendt's big examples of this is how at the moment that Germany starts to lose the Second World War, they ramp up the final solution, which takes tremendous amounts of manpower, tremendous amounts of resources, tremendous amounts of transportation, takes soldiers away from the front, takes materials away from war production, etc., etc. It's a completely illogical thing to do if you look at it from the perspective of trying to win the war, from the perspective of trying to preserve German society or the Nazi regime. But, if you look at it from the totalitarian perspective, which prizes this historical progress, this historical move toward violence, or culmination of its project. Then it makes perfect sense. If the ultimate goal of the Nazi regime is not necessarily to win the war or to preserve itself, but to enact its ideology of racial purity, then it makes a perverse sense to give up utilitarian or practical considerations. But for Arendt, the real sort of end point of totalitarianism is the complete elimination of individuality through the use of indiscriminate terror. So, dictatorial regimes utilize terror. They repress their citizens. They attempt to punish anyone who challenges or questions them. The shift from dictatorship to totalitarianism is when that's no longer the issue. Whether you've questioned, challenged, resisted, whatever it is, whether you are guilty of something, the shift to totalitarianism is when your relative guilt or innocence becomes a matter of supreme indifference in terms of whether or not the state is going to direct violence against you. So, we've got a couple of sections here where Arendt explains this, I think, really well, and I'm going to read these couple of sections to you. And hopefully this will make this a little clearer, because it seems counterintuitive. So she says here, only in the initial stages, when a struggle for power is still going on, are its victims, that's totalitarianism's, are totalitarianism's victims those who can be suspected of opposition. It then embarks upon its totalitarian career with the persecution of the objective enemy, which may be the Jews or the Poles, as in the case of the Nazis, or so-called counter-revolutionaries, an accusation which, quote, in Soviet Russia is established before any question as to the behavior of the accused has arisen at all, end quote, who may be people who at any time owned a shop or house, or, quote, had parents or grandparents who owned such things, end quote, or who happened to belong to one of the Red Army occupational forces, or were Russians of Polish origin. Only in its last and fully totalitarian stage are the concepts of the objective enemy and the logically possible crime abandoned. The victims chosen completely at random and even without being accused declared unfit to live. This new category of undesirables may consist, as in the case of the Nazis, of the mentally ill or persons with lung and heart disease, or in the Soviet Union of people who happen to have been taken up in that percentage, varying from one province to another, which is ordered to be deported. This consistent arbitrariness negates human freedom more efficiently than any tyranny could ever do. One had at least to be an enemy of tyranny in order to be punished by it. Freedom of opinion was not abolished for those who were brave enough to risk their necks. Theoretically, the choice of opposition remains in totalitarian regimes too, but such freedom is almost invalidated if committing a voluntary act only assures a punishment that everyone else may have to bear anyway. Freedom in this system has not only dwindled down to its last and apparently still indestructible guarantee, the possibility of suicide, but has lost its distinctive mark because of the consequences of its exercise are shared with completely innocent people. So in other words, what Arendt is saying here is that even if you resist the totalitarian system, it makes no difference. The value of the punishment, there's no concept of martyrdom under this system, because punishment is arbitrary. Execution is arbitrary. Imprisonment is arbitrary. Being sent to the gulags is arbitrary. It doesn't matter if you've done something wrong. It doesn't matter if you've done nothing wrong. It doesn't matter if you've done everything perfectly. You may still face the same punishment. And so that idea of human freedom, that idea of consequential action, is eliminated under the totalitarian system. And we get this, again, explained a little bit differently slightly later on. She says, under conditions of total terror, not even fear can any longer serve as an advisor of how to behave, because terror chooses its victims without reference to individual actions or thoughts, exclusively in accordance with the objective necessity of the natural or historical process. Under totalitarian conditions, fear probably is more widespread than ever before, but fear has lost its practical usefulness when actions guided by it can no longer help to avoid the dangers man fears. The same is true for sympathy or support of the regime, for total terror not only selects its victims according to objective standards, it chooses its executioners with as complete a disregard as possible for the candidate's conviction and sympathies. The consistent elimination of conviction as a motive for action has become a matter of record since the Great Purges in Soviet Russia and the satellite countries. The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any. The introduction of purely objective criteria into the selection system of the SS troops was Himmler's great organizational invention. He selected the candidates from photographs according to purely racial criteria. Nature itself decided not only who was to be eliminated, but also who was to be trained as an executioner. No guiding principle of behavior taken itself from the realm of human action, such as virtue, honor, fear, is necessarily or can be useful to set into motion a body politic which no longer uses terror as a means of intimidation, but whose essence is terror. In its stead, it has introduced an entirely new principle into public affairs that dispenses with human will to action altogether and appeals to the craving need for some insight into the law of movement according to which the terror functions and upon which, therefore, all private destinies depend. The inhabitants of a totalitarian country are thrown into and caught in the process of nature or history for the sake of accelerating its movement. As such, they can only be executioners or victims of its inherent law. The process may decide that those who today eliminate races and individuals, or the members of dying classes and decadent peoples, are tomorrow those who will be sacrificed. What totalitarian rule needs to guide the behavior of its subjects is a preparation to fit each of them equally well for the role of executioner and the role of victim. This two-sided preparation, the substitute of a principle of action, is the ideology. So in other words, the key thing about totalitarianism for Arendt is that it's arbitrary. Who lives and who dies is largely arbitrary. It's no longer coupled to individual actions. There are not penalties for particular crimes as such. Those things still do exist, but they're not central to the way that society functions. The way that society functions becomes much more capricious. Whoever it is that's swept up in the project of history or of nature, that person dies. Whether they oppose the regime, are indifferent to the regime, or actively support the regime. The individual choice is eliminated from the project of totalitarianism.